A police officer comes face to face with a scene of cruelty that will be forever seared into his memory. A helpless dog, bound and left to die, hanging from a tree. What he couldn't imagine was that this rescue would forever change the course of two lives that seemed destined never to cross again. The sun rose, cold and merciless, over dry pine, painting the Brazilian desert in shades of orange that offered no warmth. João Silva steered his patrol car down the dirt track, his tired eyes scanning the arid landscape out of sheer professional habit. 15 years on the force had taught him that even the emptiest desert could hide terrible secrets. That's when he saw it. Something strange on the horizon. A dark silhouette hanging from a lone tree that stood bravely against the barren land. The officer's heart instantly quickened, a jolt of alarm coursing through him before his mind could even process the image. Accelerating over the uneven terrain, João drew closer, his hand instinctively resting on his weapon. As the image sharpened, so did the horror blooming in his chest. It was a dog, hung by its feet, its thin, wounded body swaying gently in the morning breeze. "My God," he murmured, slamming on the brakes and leaping from the car. As he approached, he saw the animal was still breathing, its chest rising and falling with visible effort. But it was only when he got closer that an icy shock shot down his spine. Those markings on its fur, that scar on its right ear. It couldn't be. "Max?" His voice came out choked. The dog struggled to open its eyes, revealing a gaze João would never forget. It was Max, his former canine partner, reported dead 2 years ago during a tragic anti-trafficking operation. The animal he had sworn to protect. The one official reports claimed had been killed in the line of duty. Time seemed to freeze as the officer, with trembling hands, pulled a pocket knife and cut the rope. Max's weight fell into his arms, far less than it should have been, a testament to severe malnutrition. Where have you been all this time?" João whispered, hot tears stinging his face, a stark contrast to the cold morning air. The dog let out a faint whimper, a clear sign of recognition. João wrapped the animal in his jacket, noting fresh wounds and signs of prolonged abuse. As he rushed back to his car, carrying Max with the utmost care, he felt the crushing weight of guilt, mingled with an unexpected spark of hope. For 2 years, he had believed his partner was dead. For 2 years, he had carried the remorse of failing him. Now, in the middle of nowhere, fate was giving him a second chance, one he would not waste. Max's body felt almost weightless as it settled into João Silva's arms. The dog was so debilitated, he was a mere shadow of the strong partner the officer had once known. Yet, when their eyes met, João recognized the unique bond they had always shared. The dog's eyes, though clouded with pain, still held the glint of absolute trust he had always reserved for his human partner. "It's going to be okay, buddy. I'm here now," João whispered, his voice cracking as his trembling hands stroked the animal's matted, dirty fur. The metallic scent of dried blood mixed with the smell of the hot desert earth and the sweat beading on the officer's brow. Max tried to lick João's hand. It was a weak gesture, but it was laden with meaning. It was as if, even after all his suffering, the dog still wanted to comfort his old friend. "Let's get you out of here," João murmured, carefully adjusting the dog in his arms to avoid aggravating his injuries. As he ran toward the patrol car, his heart hammered in his chest, not just from the physical effort, but from the storm of emotions raging within him. Every step on the arid soil of dry pine brought back memories he had spent 2 years trying to bury. The botched operation, the gunfire, the chaos. and the decision that tormented him every night. Leaving Max behind, believing the official story that his partner had fallen. "Forgive me," he whispered to the dog, struggling to open the back door of the police vehicle. "I never should have believed them. I never should have given up on you." As he gently placed Max on the seat, João realized that this reunion, far from bringing relief, only deepened the wound in his soul. The dog's loyalty, even after everything, was a silent indictment of his own failure. There, under the unforgiving Brazilian sun, the officer felt the weight of broken promises and a trust that should never have been betrayed. Starting the engine and speeding back toward town, João made a silent vow. Whoever had done this to Max would pay. And this time, he wouldn't rest until he had unearthed every truth that Dry Pine seemed so determined to hide. At the Dry Pine police station, the silence was broken only by the hum of makeshift medical equipment. Maria Oliveira, a local veterinarian, worked with precise movements, her experienced fingers examining each of Max's wounds as João watched with a knot in his stomach. With every new discovery, the vet's brow furrowed deeper. "He's been through extreme abuse," Maria explained in a low voice, almost a whisper, as if she feared the dog might understand. "Severe malnutrition, dehydration, bruises all over his body. But what really worries me is this." She pointed to a recent scar on the dog's abdomen. "Someone performed surgery on him a few days ago, and this was not a legitimate medical procedure." João felt his stomach turn. "What kind of surgery?" "It's hard to say without more detailed tests, but it looks like something was inserted and then removed. The stitching is crude, done in a hurry." Clara Santos stood in the corner of the room, observing every movement with rapt attention. The young officer, a recent transfer to Dry Pine, had her eyes fixed on the wounded animal, her hands unconsciously clenched into fists. She didn't know João or Max before today, but the outrage in her eyes was palpable. "This isn't just an isolated case of cruelty," Clara murmured, stepping closer to the examination table. "There's something much bigger happening here." Maria applied an antibiotic to an open wound and sighed. "I've treated 3 other abandoned animals with similar marks in the last few months. I reported it to the station, but no one cared," João finished for her, running a hand over his weary face. Clara moved toward Max, who, despite his weakness, tried to lift his head at her presence. She gently stroked the fur behind his ear. "A police dog doesn't just disappear for 2 years and reappear with surgical scars by accident," she said, looking directly at João. "Someone is using these animals for something, and we need to find out what." The look they exchanged was one of mutual understanding. The vet silently continued her work, administering fluids and medication. Max whimpered softly, his half-closed eyes fixed on João, as if pleading for something the officer couldn't yet comprehend. "I'll need to keep him under observation tonight," Maria informed them, adjusting the IV drip. "By tomorrow, we'll have a better idea if he's going to pull through." Clara stepped forward. "I'll stay too. Something tells me this dog isn't safe, not even in a police station." João nodded, grateful for the unexpected ally. As he watched Max fight for his life, a certainty grew within him. This story was just beginning, and it was going to be far darker than any of them could imagine. João Silva spent the night awake, sitting in a worn wooden chair beside the makeshift bed where Max rested. An old blanket barely contained the animal's shivers, his thin, wounded body seeming as fragile as a dry leaf. With every low whimper from the dog, the officer felt a stab of guilt pierce his chest like a blade. "How could I have left you?" he murmured over and over, running his fingers through hair already disheveled from a sleepless night. The operation from 2 years ago was still an open wound in his memory. On that rainy night, when the trafficking ring ambushed his team on the edge of the desert, everything had happened too fast. Gunshots, screams, the order to retreat, and Max, charging in the opposite direction, following a scent only his keen nose could detect. João remembered the exact moment he had shouted his partner's name before being dragged back into the patrol car by his colleagues. "He's gone," they told him later. "The cartel probably got him. Forget it." But how could he forget the one who had saved his life so many times? The official report was closed with suspicious haste. The search was called off after only 3 days. The chief at the time, a man of few words and many secrets, had declared the case closed with a coldness that had always bothered João. Now, looking at Max trembling under the dim lamplight, he knew his instincts had been right all along. "Someone didn't want you to be found," he whispered, gently stroking the dog's head. "Someone knew what you could reveal." Max opened his eyes for a moment, those brown eyes that seemed to understand every word. The dog tried to lift his head, but the effort was too much. Hot tears streamed down João's face as he realized that, despite everything, there was still trust in his partner's gaze. In that moment, he made a silent vow. He didn't care who was involved, colleagues, superiors, or the powerful figures in dry pine that everyone was afraid to cross. He would see this through to the end. He would unearth every secret and face every ghost necessary to get justice. The local police preferred to keep certain stories buried in the desert sand. There was an unwritten code of silence that protected dark interests in the region. João knew that by pursuing this investigation, he was putting his career, and perhaps his life, on the line. But looking at Max, the decision was already made. He would right the wrongs of the past, no matter the cost. The next morning, as the first rays of sun cut through the windows of the police station, Clara Santos carefully examined Max's worn collar. The dog was resting in the corner, still weak, but his eyes followed the young officer's every move. It was then that her skilled fingers detected an irregularity in the texture of the leather. "João, come look at this," she called out, her heart beginning to race. João Silva hurried over, leaning across the table. Clara pointed to a small hidden compartment, expertly stitched into the inner lining of the collar. She carefully used a pair of tweezers to open the hiding spot, revealing a tiny flash drive and a piece of paper, folded many times over. "My God," João whispered, as his colleague unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a set of geographic coordinates, handwritten in faded blue ink. The officer immediately recognized the area. A desolate patch of land on the outskirts of dry pine, known to be a corridor for smugglers. "This could be the proof we need," Clara said, her eyes shining with determination. Someone turned Max into a messenger. News of the discovery spread quickly through the station, causing a stir among the officers. Some crowded around the table while others kept their distance, their gazes filled with suspicion. João noticed the hushed whispers and exchanged glances between colleagues who had never shown any interest in Max's case before. "We need to check the contents of this drive immediately," he stated, looking urgently at Clara. The veterinarian, Maria Oliveira, who had arrived to check on Max, watched the scene with concern. "Who would do something like this to an animal?" she asked, gently stroking the dog's head. João and Clara exchanged a meaningful look. They both suspected the same thing: the drug trafficking that had plagued the region for years, Stories of canine mules had circulated in the force's back channels, but never with concrete proof. We need to be careful, João murmured, slipping the drive into his pocket. We don't know who's involved in this. Max whimpered softly, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. The officer knelt beside him, feeling a mix of anger and resolve build inside him. That tiny object could be the key to unraveling not only his partner's suffering, but a much larger criminal conspiracy. We need to keep this between us for now, Clara said, glancing around suspiciously. At least until we know exactly what we have. João nodded, the weight of the flash drive in his pocket feeling as heavy as lead. That small device could change everything, or put them in mortal danger. The sun was already setting when João Silva and Clara Santos arrived at the location from the coordinates. It was a derelict warehouse on the outskirts of Dry Pine, its peeling walls and broken windows groaning with every gust of wind. They parked their vehicle at a safe distance and approached cautiously, weapons drawn. The inside of the warehouse smelled of mold and decay. Piles of old crates and debris formed a labyrinth of shadows. Clara aimed her flashlight into a dark corner where a subtle movement had caught her eye. Someone's in there, the young officer whispered as João took up a strategic position. Dry Pine Police, come out with your hands up, João commanded, his voice firm. From the shadows, a thin teenager emerged, wearing dirty clothes, his eyes wide with fear. His hands were shaking, and his face was etched with the grime of days spent without a proper wash. He was Pedro Costa, no more than 15, yet his eyes held the weight of someone who had witnessed far too many horrors for his age. Don't shoot, please, the boy implored, raising his dirty hands in surrender. I'm just hiding. João holstered his weapon and approached with caution. Clara kept her distance, but a genuine concern for the teenager's state softened her features. No one's going to hurt you, the officer assured him. What are you doing out here alone? Pedro hesitated, his gaze darting nervously towards the exits like a cornered animal. It took a few minutes of careful conversation, along with the offer of water and a sandwich from Clara's pack, before the boy began to open up. My father. They forced him to work for them, Pedro recounted, swallowing hard. When he tried to leave, they threatened our family. I ran after I saw what they did to the dogs. The words came out in ragged, broken sobs. He revealed that his father, a local mechanic, had been coerced into modifying vehicles for drug transport. But when his father discovered the scheme also used animals as mules, surgically implanting drug packages inside them, he tried to go to the police. Then, he disappeared. They sew the drugs inside the dogs, Pedro explained, his eyes welling with tears. Then they cut them back open when they reach their destination. A lot of them die on the way. A knot formed in João's throat as he thought of Max, of what his own canine partner must have endured. Can you identify these people? Clara asked, crouching to meet the boy's gaze. Pedro nodded slowly. I know all of them, and I know where they keep the other dogs. Later, sitting in a chair at the police station, his shoulders slumped, Pedro Costa revealed a truth that made João Silva's stomach turn. Max was not an isolated case. There were others, many others. They used clandestine shelters, Pedro explained, avoiding the officer's eyes. They pick up strays or steal dogs that are the right size. Then, they do the surgeries. João felt an icy fury build in his chest as the boy described how the traffickers implanted the drug packages. According to Pedro, at least 15 dogs had vanished in the last 6 months from Dry Pine and the neighboring towns. Some were found dead on the roadsides when the packages ruptured. Others were never seen again. And no one did anything? Asked Clara, her expression hardening with indignation as she jotted down every word. People know, but they're scared, the boy replied. My dad tried to speak up once. After that, we had to run. João stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sun beat down on the empty streets. In the next room, Max was resting under the care of Maria Oliveira, the town veterinarian. For 2 years, he had believed his K9 partner, Katanov, had died in the line of duty. The truth was infinitely worse. The animal had been suffering at the hands of these criminals. Can you identify any of them? João asked, turning back to Pedro. The teenager hesitated, biting his lower lip. Some are just hired muscle. But there's one man. Everyone's afraid of him. I've never seen him, but I've heard them say he runs this town. Clara and João exchanged a worried glance. Something much bigger was happening in Dry Pine. Something that went far beyond a simple case of animal cruelty. Back at the station, Max lay on an old blanket, still weak but with eyes that followed every movement. When Maria brought in an evidence bag, the dog suddenly lifted his head, sniffing the air with renewed interest. João, intrigued, watched his partner's reaction. He's reacting to something specific, the officer noted. Clara, focused on her computer, inserted the pen drive they had found on Max's collar. Her fingers drummed impatiently as the device loaded. She held her breath as the first images appeared on the screen. My God, she whispered, her face draining of color. João hurried over. The digital files were more disturbing than they could have imagined. Detailed spreadsheets with distribution routes, names of those involved in the trafficking ring, and, most shockingly, images of the surgical procedures performed on countless dogs. They're using them as living mules, Clara explained, her voice trembling with rage. The photos showed small packages being inserted into the animals' abdomens, followed by crude sutures and instructions for later extraction. João felt his stomach clench as he recognized marks identical to the scars on Max's body. The list of names included respected figures in Dry Pine, businessmen, a city councilman, and, to everyone's horror, 2 officers from their own precinct. A chill ran down João's spine. He could no longer trust anyone within these walls. We need to be extremely careful, he warned, lowering his voice. This is much bigger than we thought. As Clara copied the files, João looked out at the small town he had known since childhood. It now seemed a strange and threatening place. He knew any misstep could cost him not just his career, but his life. Max whimpered softly from across the room, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. That night, alone at home with Max sleeping at his feet, João replayed every detail in his mind. The guilt of having abandoned his partner now mingled with a steely determination. This wasn't just about justice for Max. It was for every animal sacrificed, for Pedro and his family, for an entire town held hostage by fear and silence. We're seeing this through to the end, he murmured, stroking the dog's head. I promise. As night deepened over Dry Pine, bringing a deceptive quiet, João dozed in his worn armchair. The wall clock showed nearly midnight when the crunch of furtive footsteps on the garden gravel jolted him awake. Before he could reach his weapon, the back door splintered inward with a violent crash. 3 masked men stormed the house, moving with the chilling precision of men who knew the layout. João managed to shove Max behind the sofa just before a blow sent him staggering. You should have let the dog die, Silva, one of the intruders snarled, advancing with a knife. Now we finish the job. Max, though injured, tried to rise, a weak growl rumbling in his chest. João tasted the metallic tang of blood as he fought to stay conscious. Just then, a gunshot ripped through the air, and the intruders spun towards the door. Antonio Santos stood there, clutching an old shotgun with hands that were steady despite his age. The elderly neighbor, whose eyes carried the weight of losing his own son years ago, didn't hesitate to fire a second blast into the ceiling. "Get out of his house," Antonio declared with a terrifying calm. "The next one won't be a warning." The intruders retreated, but their leader pointed a finger at João, before vanishing into the night. "This isn't over. Nobody in this town messes with what isn't theirs." When silence returned, Antonio helped João to his feet. The officer checked on Max immediately, relieved to find the dog frightened but unharmed. "How did you know?" João asked, pressing a cloth to the cut on his forehead. The old man sighed, leaning the shotgun against the wall. "I recognized one of the vehicles parked down the street. Same kind I saw lurking around my place after my son started asking questions about disappearing animals. Years ago." The revelation hit João like a physical blow. The story was older and deeper than he had imagined. Someone on the inside had leaked information about Max and the pen drive. "They'll be back," Antonio murmured, gently stroking Max's head. "And they'll bring more men." João nodded, determination hardening his gaze. "Then we'll be ready. This is personal now." With his neighbor standing guard on the porch, the officer understood he would need true allies to fight the web of cruelty that snaked through the dark corners of Dry Pine. The battle for the truth had just begun. A plan began to form, born of desperation and resolve. They would use Max to draw the criminals out, but on their own terms. "They'll come for Max," Pedro had confessed, tears streaming down his face. "I heard them. They think he still has stuff inside him." It was a horrifying thought, but it was also their only advantage. "We have to use the dog to lure them in," Antonio had said, his voice firm. "It's the only way to catch these bastards." Clara had recoiled at the idea. "Use Max as bait? After everything he's been through?" "Not as bait," João corrected her. "We'll control the situation. We won't put him in real danger." The sun was setting as João finalized the details. The operation was risky, but necessary. Max would be positioned in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Clara and two trusted federal agents would be on overwatch, while João lay in wait, ready to intercept. Maria, the vet, had reluctantly agreed, providing painkillers and detailed instructions to ensure the dog's safety. Antonio would guard Pedro at his house. At 1900 hours, everyone was in position. The radio in João's hand remained silent as he watched Max from his hiding spot. The dog lay in the center of the warehouse, seemingly vulnerable, but a hidden tracker was active in his collar. Clara, perched on the roof of a neighboring building, had a clear view of all approaches. Her heart hammered in her chest, but her hands were steady on the surveillance equipment. Suddenly, her voice crackled over the communicator, a hushed whisper. "Suspicious movement, east entrance, dark vehicle, no plates." João shifted his weight, the adrenaline surging through him. He looked toward Max, whose head was now raised, his ears pricked, listening to the approaching danger. The silence of Dry Pine had lasted long enough. Everything was going according to plan, right up until the moment his phone buzzed. A text from Antonio. "Pedro recognized someone. Says it's urgent." Seconds later, the teenager's trembling voice crackled over the line. "It's Roberto. The water delivery guy. He's one of them. The one who coordinates the surgeries on the animals. He's disguised at the main entrance to town." A chill ran down Joao's spine. The danger wasn't just closing in on the warehouse. It was seeping into the entire city. If Roberto was here, it meant their plan had been leaked. And behind the leak, Joao suspected, was Miguel Ferreira. "Clara, high alert!" João warned over the radio. "We have an insider. I repeat, we have an insider. The danger is closer than we thought." The silence of the abandoned warehouse was shattered by the first gunshot. João barely had time to shove Pedro behind a stack of crates before bullets began to ricochet off the metal walls, creating an infernal concert of echoes and shouts. "Get down!" the officer yelled, drawing his weapon as he tried to pinpoint the shooters in the warehouse shadows. Clara crawled to a defensive position, shielding the teenager with her own body. Max, his hind legs still bandaged, reacted with astonishing speed. The dog charged down the central aisle of the warehouse, barking furiously, drawing the criminal's attention. His barks echoed through the vast space, confusing the gunman about the officer's exact location. "Max, get back here!" Joao tried to call, but the animal was following his protective instinct, zigzagging between the metal columns. One of the men, dressed in a dark jacket, emerged from behind a rusted forklift, aiming directly at Clara. Joao fired twice, hitting the assailant's shoulder, who fell with a muffled cry. "They're closing in on the east exit," the officer warned, reloading her weapon with trembling hands. Pedro shivered, huddled against the wall. "They're going to kill us, just like they did the other dogs," he whispered, tears streaming down his thin face. Amid the chaos, Max detected something the humans had missed. A short, heavy-set man was sneaking behind empty barrels, fiddling with a device connected to wires. The dog recognized the scent of explosives, the same odor he had smelled during his captivity. With a deep growl, Max lunged at the man, clamping his powerful jaws around his arm. The criminal screamed, dropping the detonator, which slid across the concrete floor. Joao immediately understood the threat. "Explosives!" he yelled to Clara, sprinting toward his canine partner. A fresh volley of gunfire tore across the warehouse. The officer felt a bullet graze his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He reached Max and the struggling man, kicked the detonator far away, and neutralized the criminal with a decisive blow. Clara seized the opportunity, pulling Pedro toward the exit. As Joao cuffed the bomber, Max stood guard beside his partner, his fur on end, his eyes locked on the warehouse shadows. "You saved our lives, buddy," Joao whispered to the dog, briefly touching his head as he waited for the backup Clara had called. Max just panted in reply, as if that act of bravery were simply part of his nature, of his unshakable loyalty. The dawn that broke over Dry Pine felt different. News of the confrontation at the abandoned warehouse had spread like wildfire through the dry desert brush, and Max's name was whispered on every corner, in every market conversation. The dog who had survived being hung from a tree, who had faced death twice, was now seen as a symbol of resistance. Residents who had barely noticed the animal before now stopped João Silva on the street to ask about his canine partner's health. Maria Oliveira, her eyes dark with exhaustion after nights of caring for Max, smiled faintly as she witnessed the transformation. "He's responding well to the treatment," the veterinarian explained while changing his bandages. "This dog has more willpower than most people." Meanwhile, at the police station, Clara meticulously analyzed the files recovered from the digital device. The young officer spent hours in front of the computer, piecing together information that felt like scattered parts of a much larger puzzle. It was then that one name appeared repeatedly in coded financial transactions: Miguel Ferreira. "This can't be right," Clara muttered, calling Joao over to the screen. The officer felt his blood run cold. Miguel was practically untouchable in dry pine. A landowner, a backer of political campaigns, and, supposedly, a community benefactor. Everyone believed the businessman had been living abroad for at least 3 years. He never left, João concluded, running a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. He was hiding here the whole time, pulling all the strings. The evidence was irrefutable. The drive contained records of bank transfers, package shipping dates, and even photographs of dogs being prepared for drug transport. Miguel wasn't just a participant. He was the mastermind behind the entire operation. Pedro, who was watching from a distance, gently hugged Max. The teenager was trembling slightly, but his eyes no longer showed only fear. There was determination there. "Are you going to get him?" the boy asked in a low voice. João exchanged a look with Clara before answering. "We are. But we have to be smarter than him. Miguel has connections everywhere, including inside the police force." Antonio Santos, who had arrived with food for everyone, nodded grimly. The old man knew Miguel Ferreira's power all too well. The entire town either respected him, feared him, or admired him. The battle was only just beginning. As Max rested on his makeshift blanket, the team knew they were about to face their greatest challenge yet. This was no longer just about saving one dog. It was about dismantling an empire built on suffering and silence. João Silva felt his world crumble as he opened the final file on the flash drive. The photo of Miguel Ferreira, Dry Pine's respected businessman, was linked to every trafficking operation they had documented. He wasn't just an accomplice. He was the architect of the entire criminal scheme. The officer sank into his chair as the cruel reality unfolded before his tired eyes. "I always knew there was something wrong with him," Clara murmured, looking at the screen over her colleague's shoulder. "But everyone said he'd been abroad for years." The most disturbing part was that Miguel appeared in recent photographs, always in the background, always protected by his henchmen. João ran a hand over his face, trying to process it. How had he not seen it? How had the local police ignored so many signs? That same night, as Max slept fitfully on the living room rug, Antonio Santos knocked on João's door. The old man carried a time-yellowed folder, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My son didn't run away like everyone thinks," Antonio began, his voice thick with emotion. "Rafael discovered everything, the use of animals and children to transport drugs. When he tried to report it, he just disappeared." His neighbor opened the folder, revealing detailed notes Rafael had made years ago. There were sketches of surgically implanted compartments in dogs, distribution routes, and most shocking of all, the name Miguel Ferreira circled several times in red. "Why did you never tell me this before?" João asked, feeling a mixture of compassion and frustration. "Fear," the old man answered simply. "And later, shame for having been afraid." Just then, Max rose to his feet. He walked over to Antonio, as if he understood his pain. The dog rested his head on the man's knee, a gesture that seemed to say he too knew the cost of silence. João watched the scene and felt something stir inside him. He wasn't just fighting for Max anymore. He was fighting for Pedro, for Antonio's son, for all the children and animals sacrificed on the altar of greed. He was fighting for an entire town that had grown accustomed to looking away from evil. "I won't fail this time," João promised, as much to himself as to his unlikely allies. "We're going to expose Miguel and shut down this network for good." In that simple room, united by pain and hope, the three of them sealed a silent pact. The truth, however painful, would finally come to light. After days of tension, João Silva finally found the courage to call the contact Clara had secured. Federal Delegate Paulo Almeida answered on the third ring, his deep voice carrying the weight of years of service. João explained the situation in detail, his heart racing as he mentioned Miguel Ferreira's name. "I've been investigating that man for 3 years," Paulo revealed, to the officer's surprise. "This will be my last operation before I hang up my badge." The next morning, the federal delegate arrived in Dry Pine with a discreet team of agents and an arsenal of surveillance equipment the small station had never seen. Clara watched in awe as technicians installed the devices, thinking how drastically her career had changed in the past few weeks. "We have a unique opportunity," Paulo explained, spreading maps across the briefing room table. The gray-haired man pointed to possible cartel hideouts, basing his strategy on the flash drive data and Pedro's testimony. "Miguel thinks he's untouchable. That will be his downfall." Max, lying in a corner of the room, lifted his head as João approached. The dog was visibly stronger, thanks to Maria Oliveira's care. The vet had worked miracles, treating not only his physical wounds, but also restoring the animal's trust, which he had nearly lost. "You think he's ready?" Clara asked, gently stroking the dog's head. João nodded, a lump in his throat. Max was born for this. That afternoon, the operation began. With Max leading the way, the team headed into the desert surrounding the town. The dog, despite his recent scars, moved with renewed determination, as if every step took him further from the horror he had endured. After nearly 2 hours of walking under the punishing sun, Max stopped abruptly. He sniffed the air, then the sandy ground. He began to dig frantically, revealing what looked like a metal door camouflaged by the sand. Paulo looked at João with a mixture of admiration and surprise. "Your partner is truly something special." The team moved into strategic positions as technicians analyzed the structure. The cartel's main hideout was right there, buried beneath the dunes, invisible to the untrained eye. A shiver ran down João's spine. They were about to confront not just Miguel Ferreira, but his entire criminal empire. Max sat beside the officer, his eyes fixed on the metal door, as if he understood perfectly the importance of this moment. The final operation was about to begin, and the fate of Dry Pine would be decided in the next few hours. The sun was setting on the horizon when the raid began. João Silva drove the tactical vehicle, his eyes locked on the dirt road leading to Miguel Ferreira's isolated property. Beside him, Clara took a deep breath, checking her weapon one last time. In the back seat, Paulo Almeida coordinated the final details over the radio. Max remained alert, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. The makeshift fortress emerged from the desert dunes, a camouflaged complex of warehouses protected by armed men. The federal delegate gave the signal, and the teams advanced in formation. The first shot cut through the air like a whip, followed by a volley that shattered the silence of the falling night. João and Clara took cover behind a stack of crates as the firefight intensified. The officer glanced at his canine partner, who awaited his command with impressive discipline, despite his recent scars. "This way," João whispered, pointing to a less guarded side entrance. The 3 officers and Max advanced under covering fire. Clara took down 2 men who were trying to block their access, while Paulo coordinated the encirclement from the rear. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the desert dust, creating a dense, suffocating haze. In the center of the complex, they found Miguel frantically destroying documents. Seeing them, the businessman drew a weapon and pointed it at João. "It's over, Miguel," the officer declared, his aim steady. Nothing is ever over for me, Silva, the criminal replied with a cold smile, his free hand reaching for a device on the table. In that instant, Max, sensing the new threat, launched himself in a precise leap. His teeth sank into Miguel's arm. The man howled in pain, dropping both his gun and the detonator that would have destroyed all the evidence. The businessman collapsed to the floor, immobilized by the very animal who, though exhausted and scarred by abuse, did not hesitate to protect his companions. Clara quickly cuffed Miguel while Paulo secured the evidence he had tried to destroy, documents linking local politicians and businessmen to the animal trafficking scheme. João knelt beside Max, stroking his head with gratitude. The dog, panting but visibly proud, licked his human partner's hand. "You were always the best of us," the officer murmured, as the sirens of approaching reinforcements grew louder. That night, as Miguel Ferreira and his accomplices were escorted out of their fallen fortress, the look that passed between João and Max carried the weight of a shared journey and the silent promise of better days ahead. With Miguel Ferreira's gang finally dismantled, Dry Pine breathed a renewed air. The streets of the small Brazilian town, once dominated by a silent fear, now saw people talking freely on the sidewalks. João Silva watched the transformation of his town with a mix of relief and melancholy, stroking the head of Max, who rested peacefully beside him. "We made it, partner," the officer murmured, noting how the scars on the dog's fur mirrored his own, invisible, yet just as deep. Both carried marks that time could soften, but never fully erase. The first rays of autumn sun streamed through the living room window, illuminating the graying fur of the old police dog. Max, now older and marked by a lifetime of courage, lay by the hearth in João's home. His eyes, though less sharp, still shone with unwavering loyalty as they followed his master's every move. João ran his fingers over the dog's ears, feeling each notch and scar as a reminder of the journey they had shared. Some nights, Max would still jolt awake, as if reliving moments of terror from the past, and João was always there to soothe him back to a peaceful sleep. Out in the central square of Dry Pine, a new life was taking root. Pedro Costa, the once terrified and distrustful teenager, now ran freely in new sneakers, a gift from Antonio Santos. He had found an unexpected home with the old man, and the void left by Antonio's own lost son was slowly, timidly being filled by the boy's presence. They were healing their wounds together, day by day. Clara Santos, now a local hero, laughed as she chased Pedro in a playful game. Her unshakable determination had inspired a wave of solidarity that had remade the town. Residents who once barely nodded to each other now stopped to chat, sharing ideas for the future. Sitting on a nearby bench, the veterinarian Maria Oliveira watched them with a gentle smile. She remembered the day Max had arrived in her arms, barely alive. He was the town's quiet hero, and she had since treated 5 other dogs rescued from that same operation, all now in loving homes. The victory had been cemented months earlier, on a day bathed in golden light. João often found his mind drifting back to it. He remembered standing before the municipal courthouse as the mayor, in an emotional speech, declared Max a hero of Dry Pine. The whole town had been there. Federal delegate Paulo Almeida, before returning to the capital to finish his career, had personally placed a medal on Max's new collar. It had been a fitting end to a distinguished career, ensuring the entire criminal network faced justice. João remembered the thunderous applause. He remembered seeing Pedro standing beside Antonio, smiling like a child for the first time. He remembered Clara, her badge gleaming in the sun, and he remembered his own words, his voice steady as he spoke to the crowd. Max represents what we had forgotten, he had said. Unconditional loyalty, courage without expectation of reward, and the ability to forgive when we cannot. Now, watching the town from his porch, João felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't known in years. The guilt that once consumed him had given way to a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't change the past, but he had redeemed his failures, not just by saving Max, but by helping to save a community. The scars would remain, for him and for the town. But as the sun set, casting a warm, generous glow over dry pine, João understood. What had begun as a tragedy had been transformed into redemption. A city, like its people, was finding its way forward, not as it was before, but as something new, forged in the pain and hope that only the greatest trials can bring. Here, with his hand on Max's fur and his heart finally light, João Silva knew he was home.